University. This week on Office Hours, when a murder occurs in the community, the nonprofit Religious Coalition for a Nonviolent Durham responds with a vigil. We're also running support groups for men and women who have recently left prison. The coalition is run by Duke alumna Marcia Owen and is the subject of a new book by Owen and Duke Chapel Dean Sam Wells. Owen and Wells take your questions on violence in the community.
I'm James Todd with Duke's News Office, and I am here with Samuel Wells, Dean of Duke Chapel, and also Marcia Owen, a Duke alumna and the director of the Religious Coalition for a Nonviolent Durham. And as we begin the conversation, I should say that I've been a member of a coalition faith team support group, so I bring that perspective. So to start, Marcia Owen, you and the coalition last week organized one of these vigils. It was for a man who was killed this summer, Santiago Hernandez Arredondo. Could you just describe the vigil and tell how it came to be?
Certainly. The vigil came to be because of our dear friend, Father Bill at Immaculate Conception Catholic Church, where the family is members. Mm-hmm. And he called and said that the family had requested a vigil and would like to go to the place where the tragedy had occurred to pray and to be together as a family and to really reclaim that place. And so it was organized through us, and we invite the entire community. We're an inclusive organization. All are welcome, regardless of faith, age. And so we gathered across the street for where this dear man had been shot to death.
And what's going through your heart and your mind as you're present at one of these vigils?
That God is with us, that the peace of God is in our relationship, in being present beside family and community members, that this is a manifestation of one of the greatest truths of my life, which is we belong together and that we can carry one another's loads, and that we need to be in relationship to let love exist.
In Dean Wells, when you and Marcia Owen write in the book, you say that the heart of these vigils lies in the practice of lament. What do you mean by the practice of lament?
I think it's when you say to somebody else, or particularly to God, I hate you because of this. I hate that you've done this. I hate that this has happened. And if you like, in the shouting, in the letting out the full range of your emotion lies the trust. Because you actually wouldn't say that if you felt there was a fragility of a relationship that was going to be lost. It's the child that is beating its hands into the pillow. And yet somehow the harder a child beats their hands into the pillow, the softer the pillow becomes. The more giving there is. And so there's a cathartic letting out of anger, exasperation, bewilderment, despair. So there's a strong emotional side to lament. But within that there's a profound sense that you only do that when you know that the one you're doing it to can take it. Mm-hmm. I grew up in a household where one of my parents was seriously ill all the way through my childhood. I think I never really did that because I never really believed my mother was strong enough to take my anger. But I had to learn how to do that in prayer with God, and to believe that God could take my anger. I think there's often a danger in the way people of faith talk about suffering, that they almost want to make excuses for God because deep down they're not sure God can handle the truth. And so lament is turning truth into a prayer, however uncomfortable the truth is.
And Marcia Owen, you and Sam write in the book that people of faith have done a terrible disservice to one another by thinking that if they love God, they're not supposed to feel pain.
Right.
What does that mean to you in the context of these vigils?
There's enormous pain. I think that it's just the opposite. It's the paradox, at least in the experience of my life over these last years with the 19 years with the coalition, that the greater I open my heart to the mystery, the more, the louder the suffering becomes. It's a surrender, is another way I think you were describing it, to just surrender to your pain and the suffering. It's not to be spiritual, means to be open to all things, to be radically accepting of what is. And what is so often is extraordinarily unjust, incomprehensibly tragic, suffering beyond words and reason. And so the vigil allows all of us to surrender to that truth, and yet to endure together.
Another piece of context I want to set for especially this vigil that you just had a couple of weeks ago is when I looked up media reports about it, they're short stories, and they tend to focus on the criminal charges and the suspects. So could you say, a man was murdered, Santiago Hernandez Arredondo. Could you just say, who was this man? What did you learn about him from organizing the vigil and being present there?
Yes, that's very, very important. And that was one of the motivations in the beginning for the vigils, is that when we would read media reports about victims of violence and homicide in particular, it was almost like we were reaching to find a reason that this could happen, and that reason was often the victim. What did the victim do? And the victim's not here, and this case in Mr. Hernandez, he was a family man, an extremely capable and successful contractor. He was also extremely spiritual and loyal to his parish. He had, I learned that he had gone in where the fathers live, the house where the Franciscan fathers live at Immaculate Conception, needed some work done on the house. And he did it and refused payment. He was generous, he was loving, and he was here because he wanted his family and his children to have the opportunities of this country, education and work, and he was a wonderful man and has a beautiful family.
We've been talking about the vigils, and of course the focus there is on the victim and the victim's family. But another important piece of the Religious Coalition for Nonviolent Durham is to reach out to men and women who've committed violent crimes, serious crimes. Could you give us both a kind of a how and a why for that aspect of the coalition?
Yes, I think this is your favorite part of the book, or favorite part of the story that we share in the book. I was at a vigil, and I had been organizing, coordinating the vigils for years at this point. And we were having a vigil downtown Durham, and the neighbors, another reason the vigils are so meaningful to me is that it's to have the physical presence of people who are not family, to recognize the sanctity of that person, and the unity of this community, the spiritual unity of it. And also to show the children of these neighborhoods that adults, caring adults in this community, recognize that this tragedy has happened, recognize the injustice of it, and recognize that God is with us and change is inevitable.
When someone comes out of prison, how do they intersect with you?
Right. And the reason that we began to reaching out to people coming in from prison is that over those years, my heart had really hardened towards the accused. And how could this happen? How could somebody forget that these people were so precious and so sacred. And then one night, these two young men came walking down the street. Reverend Joe Harvard at First Presbyterian Church was leading the vigil and joined us. And at the end of his prayer, this young man said, "This is good. Thank you for doing this." And my heart opened. I thought, what a lovely thing to say. You know, this young man who, you know, just not the type of character I expected. And then he walked off, and one of the neighbors whispered in my ear, "They're coming home from prison." And I thought, wow, I've never met anybody who's been in prison. And then a few weeks later, I also received a call from this woman, this neighbor, and said, the boy who said, "Thank you," the young man, at my age, he was almost like a boy, that he has been shot and killed. And so we should most certainly do a vigil for him. And I just realized the grief of that was so great. And I realized all the many ways I have not loved, and I do not love, the assumptions that I make, the ways that I categorize people, that there are victims and there's offenders, and it's okay to love these folks, but don't get too close to these guys, you know, and so just was filled with a love that is indescribable, and realized that we needed to reach out and be in the presence of not only families who are suffering from violence, but in the presence of those who have committed violence, and hence the reconciliation and reentry ministry.
And what are the nuts and bolts? Because I think, again, many folks might be in your position. I've never met someone who's been in prison.
Right.
You know, besides going to prison, which seems kind of hard, how do I find these people? How do we start a relationship? So how does...
That's right. And the way that we were able to do that, it took 2 years at least of discussion and discernment. How do we have a responsible, dignified relationship? I can't just stand outside prison gates and say, anybody going to Durham and want a faith team, much less. And we have the great fortune of working with the Durham County Criminal Justice Resource Center. It's a Durham County agency that provides services to people on intensive probation and also people coming home from prison, our friends, who are on post-release supervision. I won't get too technical, but just to say these are folks that have committed very, very serious felonies. You know, homicide, murder, assaults, rapes. And when they come home, they are required to be on probation. And so by working with professionals who know these folks and have the services and can do all the heavy lifting, that allows us to get to know them, to be introduced to them, and to have the kind of supervision and resources that we need to have just so that we can be simply faithful. We don't have to be therapists or probation officers or anything. We can just be ourselves.
And you mentioned the faith teams. These would be local congregations, small groups, local congregations that meet regularly in a support role.
That's right.
With these men and women. And so to get into this, we actually have a short interview with two men who've been faith team partners that have come out of prison and been a part of these support groups. This was at a recent fundraiser breakfast. So let's listen to those interviews.
I went to prison. You come out and you feel like, man, I'm just scum. And here were people who didn't treat me like I was scum, that treated me like I was just a normal person. And I cannot overemphasize the value of that. Just having somebody look at you and say, you know, we like you just for you, when a great many people in the world don't.
It's all about believing in them and giving them a chance. You know, many out there like me, if you just give them a chance, they can be hard-working city employees and stewards of Durham, just like I am.
That's Mr. Drew Dahl and Mr. Peter Bell testifying about their experience with the Religious Coalition for a Nonviolent Durham at a recent fundraising breakfast. And Dean Wells, when you hear testimonies like that, what does that tell you about the character, the nature of this ministry?
I think what people discover when they're in a re-entry team there's the partner, and we've just seen a couple of the partners, and then gathering around them as a group of the members of the team. And what happens in those situations is that you start by thinking, well, this is the prisoner, and here's the rest of us who are the normal ones. But it doesn't take more than 2 or 3 conversations before you realise you're all in prison of one kind or another. That you're all either prisons of your own making or prisons that you've been put in by others, whether those are formal addictions or addictions that we don't recognise as addictions, whether those are prisons with walls or prisons of oppressive relationships. You know, as you go around the room, people have got memories of difficult times in prison, other people have got memories of difficult times as children. And they've gone on to form, you know, they may say, well, yeah, I mean, I had a very, very painful childhood, but I've gone on to be a university administrator, I've gone on to be a respectable member of the community, whatever it might be. And in the end, the partner is going to say, well, maybe I can do that too. Maybe I don't have to be a prisoner of my past, because you're not a prisoner of your past. In fact, looking at you, no one would ever know you've been through what you've been through. In fact, you're so good at covering up, you've almost forgotten yourself. And maybe I could be like that. That's the kind of thing that happens. And you recognise, I mean, and I was very aware of this the other day when I was talking to a friend about a similar kind of ministry that works with people with serious illness. This was a person with multiple sclerosis, and they had a team gathered around them, very much like these re-entry teams gather around prisoners. And they reached an important threshold because that person, unfortunately, as sometimes happens with MS, reached the point where they needed 24-hour care, and it was clear that they were in their last sort of year or so of life. And that team had really thought of themselves as people who went and ran errands for this person, and you know, and that's a part of re-entry teams as well. But then when they had 24-hour care, they thought, well, this isn't really kind of right. There isn't really a place for us anymore. And I said to them, well, and that's because, of course, you're not dying, are you? There's nothing wrong with you. There's only one person in the corner who's dying, and the rest of you are going to live forever, aren't you? And what we ended up talking about was the fact that, of course, this was a group where people learnt how to die. Now you might think, oh, well, none of us really need to know that. Really? You know, and it's a similar dynamic. You know, we're all ill, we're all terminally ill, we're all dying, and we're all prisoners. And these things are a great leveler.
Good. We're getting into some deep waters here. We've got some questions that come in from viewers, so I want to make sure we get to those.
Okay.
And remind everybody watching that you're invited to participate in this office hours conversation by email, by Twitter, or by Facebook. So Laura wants some background here. She says, my question is for Marcia. How did you get started with this coalition? What was your path to this after your time at Duke?
My path after Duke was business, to go slay the capitalist dragon. And after, my dragon wasn't very big, but I did that. I came home to Durham after living in New York City and Washington, D.C. And
you grew up in Durham.
And thank you. And I grew up in Durham and came home to the love of my family and friends, and recognized that there was just huge levels of violence, that people were getting killed almost every week, more often than every week, and that these were young men. And I was the mother of 2 sons, and motherhood changed me, and I found that I loved my children so much that I was loving everybody else's too. I just couldn't help it. My cup ran over, and so then I had also confronted the AIDS epidemic in New York City and had confronted death, and that became very clear to me that we are all dying, and not to run away from that, but to run towards it. And so through my involvement at my local church, Epworth United Methodist, I was on an AIDS care team, which brought me into Durham and introduced me to families where the gun violence was just so acute. And in just hanging out in those neighborhoods and listening to the moms with my younger son as well, because he was still a toddler, boy, it just took me to my knees. And so I learned through Leslie Dunbar. I was at actually another Duke grad who had gone to Duke with me and had stayed in Durham.
And a co-founder of the coalition.
Yes, and met the co-founder of the coalition, Leslie Dunbar, who then brought me to Reverend Mel Williams of Watt Street Baptist Church, and that was, the deal was done. These two of the greatest men I've ever met. So I just tried to keep up with them for the rest of the time. But joined this every fourth Thursday luncheon that they had organized for the faith community, laity and ministers, to answer the question, what response is God calling us to have? And so, and on it went.
You're talking about becoming a mother and this love for children overflowing. That actually ties to a question here. Stuart has emailed in and said, are you concerned about the long-term psychological costs, especially for children, of gun violence in our community? We saw children at that vigil.
Yes. Oh, yes.
And how do you handle that when we're talking to children about the death of a family member or a family member going to prison and not being able to live with them?
Traumatic grief is different than any other kind of grief. Mm-hmm. And so, and oftentimes our focus is on the parents, and the children are ignored, that there's a resiliency there because they can't articulate their feelings as well, maybe, as an adult. So we have a wonderful partnership with the Duke Center for Child and Family Health. There you have it. And they have traumatic grief counselors that are very, very good at this. And for children who are really suffering, that's who I refer the families to. But as far as just families in general, my son, younger son, attended R.N. Harris Elementary School, which is in an area where there is an enormous amount of gun violence. And I would listen to the children talk about it and read their essays on the wall, asking for the shooting to stop. And over every year, this seemed to be the theme. And I think that the most important thing that we can do in Durham is not to isolate ourselves from one another, and especially those families, and to let the children know that there are caring adults in this community who are responding, that this isn't just business as usual, that this is not okay, that this is exactly what God does not want for us, and hence a response.
And Dean Wells, what about yourself as a pastor when you're speaking with children in one of these difficult situations?
I think you simply have to find the resources to be with them, and not to try to come out with a series of phrases that suggests it's okay and it didn't really happen. I mean, I think a lot of us, our instincts with children is to be paternal, maternal, and assume that our role is to reassure them that bad things don't happen. And I just don't think that's appropriate. It's painful, but I think what we want to say to children is bad things have happened, will continue to happen in your life, but I'm not going to run away from you. I'm not going to run away from them, and I'm not going to run away from you in them. I think that's the best we can do.
We've got another question here with a political dimension, and I want to remind everybody watching that you are invited to participate in this office hours conversation. You can do that by email to live@duke.edu. You can tweet in a question with the tag Duke Live, or post a comment on the Duke University Facebook page. So Jack writes, Marcia, your description of feeling compassion for prisoners who committed terrible crimes stands in sharp contrast to what we saw in a Republican presidential debate recently, when the audience cheered at Governor Perry's description of Texas executing prisoners. Is there any middle ground between these poles of forgiveness and retribution?
I'd like to share, well, first I'd like to say that when I think of peace, and people say, peace now. when I think I pray for peace for Durham, what I pray for is the dignity of all people. That is peace, when we affirm the dignity and worth of every individual. And when I heard that story as well, I thought of a mother of a homicide victim, a friend of mine, and how she was describing beautifully her experience of how she should relate to the person who killed her son, which shattered her life. And she said, I would never want him killed. That I would never want to put another mother, father, brother, cousins, friends through this. That by killing the killer of my son, I will then punish the people who did not kill my son. Those are the people we're punishing. And I think that I thought that was extremely profound. That I have experienced and heard such extraordinary mercy from people who have every reason to be merciless. so much pain. And that has certainly informed my life. And again, I just think it goes back to dignity, human dignity, that's in fact where peace is born.
If I was going into a debate with Governor Perry, which is not something I'm really aspiring to doing, you might be relieved to know, but I think I'd say to Governor Perry, that's a view you're perfectly entitled to hold as a citizen and as a government administrator, but I'm not sure it's a view that you're entitled to hold as a Christian.
Why?
Well, if you look in the Old Testament and in the history of ancient Rome, in both histories, you've got this tradition of cities of refuge. That's to say, when you've done a crime, you've got a place you can run away to. You know, it's clearly difficult for you to operate within your normal relationships when you've done a terrible thing. So they both evolved traditions of cities of refuge where you could run away to.
Also had execution traditions. I mean.
Well, but the point is that what is that city of refuge? That's the place you run away to be given another chance, to have a chance to find redemption and to be able to redeem yourself. Moses ran away, if you like, in a similar way, and came back and became a liberator.
Jesus ran away.
Quite. Well, we have a name in Christianity for the cities of refuge. It's called the church. The church is full of people who are saints with a past and sinners with a future. That's what the church is. If we think we're in any position to make judgments over other people as having terrible things without realizing what we've done ourselves, we're fools.
And we're getting into some of the theology of it here, and I want to bring it up since it's front and center in the book, this idea of being with. It's something that you, Sam, saw in Marcia's ministry. So we actually, it's something you've preached on for a while. We've got a clip of you preaching on that. So let's listen to this clip of Dean Sam Wells preaching. This is about Nazareth.
If something is wrong, and you are a person who wants to help, there are broadly three ways to do so. One is working for, another is working with, and a third is being with. Working for means doing things on behalf of other people, like physicians or attorneys do. There's a place for it, and it often makes the expert feel good, but it tends to perpetuate relationships of inequality and to inhibit real friendships, because it's rather humiliating always to need someone to do things for you. Working with means bringing different skills and experience together around a common goal. It can create a wonderful sense of partnership, provided that the agenda is being set by the person in need rather than the person trying to help. But being with adds an extra dimension. Being with means experiencing in one's own life something of what it is to be needy, to be disempowered. It means setting aside one's plans and strategies for change and simply feeling with the poor the pain of their situation.
Duke Chapel Dean Samuel Wells, preaching in Duke Chapel, 2006. So, in your own words, Dean Wells, the concept of being with, how did you see that manifest in the coalition?
Well, the coalition started, quite understandably, saying we can solve this problem. We can go to Raleigh, we can get the laws changed, we can take the guns out of people's hands. That's what I think of as a classic working for. It's got some real strengths. I mean, it could have done an awful lot of good. There was various ways in which behind the scenes those plans were subverted, as often happens with good intentions. Can do an awful lot of good. But the problem at the heart of it is it doesn't require ever meeting somebody who's committed a homicide or who's been a family member. You never actually, because you know, without talking to them, you know what they need. That's the problem with working for. And working with has real advantages, and I mean, that's a great deal still a part of the coalition's work. You're concerned, you have got a certain level of expertise. You might have an expertise as a therapist, you might have an expertise as a community activist, as an expertise as an attorney, or whatever it might be. You feel you've got something to bring, a journalist maybe. But the point about working with is you don't feel you always chair the meeting. You don't set the agenda. The agenda is set by others. And the community lunch roundtables, for example, which happen every month and the coalition hosts, are occasions where professional people and people who are generally concerned, and then people who've been in the heart of these situations themselves, sit down together. That's what working with does. But being with fundamentally is actually leaving your skills to one side and saying, really, I'm here with my humanity, not to solve your problem, because I don't see you as a victim. I see you as James. Mm-hmm. You have a name.
Right.
And actually the fact that you've lost a family member, it's up to you to tell me whether that's the most interesting thing about you. Mm-hmm. I don't just see you as person A who lost family member, and I have this sort of textbook which tells me how to relate to you, mm-hmm. or how to solve your problem. You can't solve the problem. Right. I mean, that's how can you solve the problem of bereavement? You can't. They've gone. Deal with it. Mm-hmm. And therefore you have to find other ways to relate to people other than to say, oh, I did this graduate school course and I now know how to handle your problem. You can't handle the problem of bereavement. They've gone, sunshine. And so the temptation to say, well, there's nothing I can do for you, and leave the room. I'm going to go and help people that my techniques that I learned at graduate school tell me how to help. But then, of course, you end up leaving somebody alone. And being with is saying, I'm going to be here even though there's nothing I learned at graduate school that's got anything to tell me about what to do. So maybe I just walk with you, I hang out with you, I listen to you, I cook a meal with you, I go to the bowling with you, whatever it might be. In a sense, I am with you as your life begins again, and I celebrate that with you.
We've got a viewer question come in that's related. This is from Robin. And a reminder to everybody watching, you're invited to participate in this office hours conversation by email, live@duke.edu, Twitter, Duke Live, or the Duke University Facebook page. So Robin asks, as someone who walks with and is present with those who are suffering tremendous violence, how do you personally keep your sanity, keep from running away? Let's start with you, Marcia.
Keep your sanity and keep from running away. Well, it's very wonderful to have people around you who love you. That's helpful. So and prayer. I don't think you can have the presence that you speak of without the prayer, or you may call it meditation or quiet or listening to the mystery, but to be able to experience the love of God.
And you said this ministry has changed your understanding of prayer.
Yes. That I kind of grew up in a tradition where, well, at least for me, I picked up that I would tell God what I wanted. Oh, yes. Yes, quite. And then as especially the vigil ministry, that it just became very clear to me that had nothing to do with faith. Me telling God what I want is not being faithful. That what is faithful is for me to be quiet and to listen to God, and then act accordingly. And in that listening, it was very, very helpful in developing, especially the reconciliation reentry ministry. The two things that just kept coming over and over was love needs no gain, and I'm still thankful for that, and do no harm, and that was very helpful. So that has it's a real affirmation that all that is another way I speak of God, is present, and that's how I don't go crazy. And also, I find myself very funny. I can't help it, and so I laugh a lot. I
Do you
think humor is
Dean
pretty
Wells,
good.
Robin's question about not running away, staying sane?
Yeah, I think there are two things that keep me going in life, really, on a personal level. One is to meet God. I mean, call me old-fashioned, but that's pretty exciting.
Yes.
And you can be in these situations, and you actually meet, where is God most fully revealed in the Bible? On the cross. Places of suffering can be at least, if not more, fully places of encounter with God than others. And sometimes meeting God is very exhausting. But it feels real and alive. and so, in a sense, you don't need to have a break from it.
That's right.
And then the second thing is feeling myself fully alive. This is what I was called to do. Everything in my life has led up to this moment. All the things I most value in my friends and my friends most value in me are called upon right now. There's something incredibly energizing about that, to say, if you're driving a car, you've done it 1,000 times, 1,000,000 times before, you don't give it any thought, you don't find it deeply satisfying. But if you're in a situation and the person is crying out, I remember, I think the second time I ever was asked to take a funeral, back 20 years ago when I started in ministry, and I went to the door, and the person answered the door and said, most people get a chance to live to about 80 years old, but my dad at the age of 54, so there isn't a God, is there?
And your response?
And I said, I'm really sorry. Mm-hmm. But I think, in some ways, all of my academic and pastoral training goes into the way I try to say, I'm really sorry. Because there's 1,000 ways to say that. But actually coming away from that visit, I was tired, because clearly these people were in the heart of lament that we talked about before. But I didn't sort of think, I've got to go for the whiskey bottle. Although I do occasionally go for the whiskey bottle, but there was something deeply satisfying about that, because I thought, well, I'm a pastor, and this is what I do. I come into situations where people don't have any words and don't know what to say, and I try to find ways in which that becomes a prayer. That's what I do.
You all seem to be provoking some questions, because we've got another one that's come in here by email, and everyone watching can participate in this office hours conversation. You can do that by email, live@duke.edu, by Twitter with the tag Duke Live, or on the Duke University Facebook page. So this one has come in from JR, and he says, there's a little length to it, let's get through it. I hear you say there's no graduate school course to teach us how to solve bereavement, your quote earlier. But isn't the logic that leads to us to think that graduate school might give us such tools based on the notion that there must be some proper technique for dealing with bereavement, and scientists or academics are the best people to discover that technique? So, is your notion of being with just another technique that the academics haven't tried, or is there something more subversive to it? I guess that's to you, Dean Wells.
Well, I'd answer that question by saying, what's eternity like? I think when Christians say we want you to be saved, what's the problem? And the problem is probably that you're going to die, and then you might go downstairs, whatever we think downstairs is. And so we don't want you to die. We want you to live forever. But if you think about it, just simply living forever, alone is a kind of hell. So the Christian notion of heaven is much richer than that. It's actually being with one another and being with God. Being with one another. So that's what that's God's gift of eternity. That's how God chooses to spend eternity. That's something we should take quite seriously in terms of our conception. That's not really a technique. The techniques are all for helping us avoid death by, putting makeup on and having great treatments in hospitals. And these things are very nice. I'm very grateful. I wouldn't be here without some of those techniques, having had some, difficult moments along the way. But finally, those don't address the real problem, because the real problem isn't mortality. The real problem is isolation. And isolation can't be overcome with technique.
Marcia Owen, do you want to speak to that? You all talk about silence and touch as a way of being present, but also some of the limits of that, or some of the pitfalls of awkwardness or miscommunication. So what about being present, that is a practice, something you learn, but then is not, is what Dean Wells is saying?
Well, I think that being with is love. I don't know how I can love someone, really love someone from afar. I can, on a very mystical level, but on a very real, my life level, it insists upon it. I need to touch you. I need to be with you. I need to be in such close proximity that I can be silent with you and sit with you and touch. I can't imagine expressing love without that. And that is also the nature. That's why it's so important, is that eternity. That one of the things that I experience all the time, is that that love grows. It seems to be the nature of love to grow, and that it is not bound by time and space. That there is no beginning and there is no end. And so it's very paradoxical, because you grow by giving it away. You end up possessing more and more the more you just let it flow from your life. And how can you do that in any other way than being physically present with someone who is suffering or someone who is not suffering? So that it is a very radical, I think it's a very radical idea this guy's come up with.
And speaking of challenges to the ministry in preparing for this, I spoke to a friend that has spent time in prison and been in the sort of the receiving end, if you will, of prison ministry, and he said, a lot of people have great intentions. A lot of the time I felt like they were making themselves feel good more than doing anything for me. He said, I'm out of prison now. I need a job. I'd be happy to talk to you if you have a job for me. There's high unemployment, even if you don't have a record. Right. But with a record, that's what I need. So what, where there has to be a kind of also a rubber meets the road in these relationships.
Well, yeah, exactly. I use the word love, and that may be very, very way too abstract. Love is extraordinarily practical. It's getting up in the middle of the night with your newborn. And in this case, and with folks coming, for either families who are suffering the tragic, violent death of a loved one, or a brother or sister coming home from prison, that there are very practical things to do. And I would just suggest that you don't attempt any of those until you have been with one another long enough to, in kind of a Jungian way, let the mask drop, and that we see one another for who we really are, that we all suffer, that there is, there is no other. There is just us. And so, for example, getting a job, one of the things that's so marvelous with the faith teams is not only being able to share the resources of your personal community of friends and family, but to to affirm your partner's employment efforts. There's the gentleman that you heard, Peter Bell. When he went to his interview, his faith team had called the human resources director, and so he walks in, and this has happened many times actually over the course of the ministry, and she's like, "I had to meet you. You have so many friends. You have all these friends," and I'm a former employer, and I know that I really loved when friends would call. Actually, when I would get when I would interview people, and I took people who were not in the family, a little bit more seriously too. And so when you've got someone coming home who's been very isolated, cast far, far away, you need more than just family to put in a good word.
Dean Wells, what about that? Is there a pivot in a relationship when you move from silence and gentle touches to doing something, working for even?
There is, but I think I have this. Every morning you take the kids to school, the shoelace is undone. Do I always do up that shoelace? Is that really being a father? I mean, it's quicker. Clearly, and it's what my child probably wants. But the fact that it's more efficient and it's what my child wants doesn't make it the right way to relate to my child. When somebody says, "I need a job," then they may think they're saying, "Give me a job," but really being with is staying with someone, even if they haven't got a job, and saying you're still a valuable person to be around. Which isn't the way most of society sees us. But also, I want to be with you until you get a job for yourself. Otherwise, there's always going to be this relationship inequality where you look to me as the benefactor. That makes me feel great. I've provided jobs for so many people. Aren't I wonderful? And that's fine for you for the time being. It gets you, some income for your household and so on. But it's in terms of human dignity, it's not really at the races. It's well behind. So the ideal model is you walk with someone while they find a job for yourself. Now, there's no reason, as Marcia says, why that doesn't mean that you, when they're going for an interview, you don't call somebody who knows someone and says, "Take this guy seriously." Mm-hmm. There's more to him than meets the eye. He's got something on his record, but a lot of us might have something on our record. He's terrific. Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure. There's a place for that. But there isn't a place for that in the absence of the being with. Do you see what I mean? You in a sense, you can have, as long as you've got the being with, you can have the working for. What I'm anxious about is the working for that is actually an avoidance of being with. It's sort of saying, get people jobs, and then we don't have to spend time with people.
That's right.
Mm-hmm. We're coming up on the hour here. There's a question I want to get in that when I saw the title of the book before getting into it, the Living Without Enemies, and acknowledging the sort of the limits of meaning you can cram into a title. I thought of Jesus' famous words to love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. So talk about the difference of God not having enemies, but maybe we do. in that difference of not having enemies versus loving enemies. I don't know if that's a...
I've learned a lot from community organising, that in a sense you're constantly broadening the coalition. You're looking at the energy that's around, and people may be enemies for a sort of short-term way of bringing an issue to a head, but no permanent enemies is one of the principles of community organising, and I've been very influenced by that. That I see everybody as, if you like, bundles of energy, and that can clearly be destructive. And it can clearly be undermining of one's own desires in life, but it's energy, and it can be put to good ends.
And I would just say that again, when I was at least attempting to listen to God, that just came exploding in my head that. God has no enemies, and neither should I. And that it's perceptions again. That you can do something that someone would say, "Oh, he's he's out to get you, destroy you. But that doesn't and should not erase the fact that he may feel very strongly about destroying me. And he's still my brother, that he was knit in the womb by the same hands of God. And that it's an illusion. The ways that we create enemies, it's an illusion, and it is not permanent. That we will live in eternity together. I just think it's, again, peace for me is rooted in the affirmation of dignity and the sacredness of each and every one of us. And it's just like the victims and offenders. If I start saying, oh, not them, I'm sunk, because that means not me either. Mm-hmm. I mean, I'm out then. You're out of the game, I'm out of the game. Because otherwise it is just the hubris of religion. It's not the grace of God.
You've both been very generous with your time. I want to close with a final, maybe practical question, which is the next time somebody watching reads about a murder in their community, hears about one, knows a friend of a friend, what's your advice?
Well, please call. Please call me, mm-hmm. And let us be with you.
Dean Wells.
I think the lesson, one of the lessons is that we both try to stress is that a lot of our instincts are to run away from these kind of times of trauma. Either we're frightened of saying the wrong thing, or we feel that suffering is kind of infectious. And that if we're close to someone who's suffering, we'll feel miserable too, and we've got enough in our life and all that kind of thing. I think we've both found lessons that actually suffering in others is something that you find grace in walking towards.
Samuel Wells, Dean of Duke Chapel, thank you for participating in this office hours. And Marcia Owen, Duke alumna and director of the Religious Coalition for a Nonviolent Durham, thank you for taking time and answering questions.
My pleasure. Thanks.
Thanks, everybody, for watching. You can join us next week on Office Hours as Professor Juanima Lubiano takes your questions about using literary tools on everyday objects. A recording of this Office Hours conversation will be available, along with many other Duke videos, on the Duke On Demand website. That's ondemand.duke.edu.